There we go. Um, Forge I'm still a hard man. Let's go. Awesome. All right. First of all, I'm afraid that I might have to break this up into two parts. Two or three parts. I'm not for sure yet. There's a lot of things here to cover today. I might have to break this up into two parts. Not for sure yet. Anyways, I am your host, Imperator of Forge, otherwise known as ForgeWarHammer. And today, I will be doing life in medieval Western European kingdoms. This is going to correspond to Catholic, Latin, or Roman Catholic Christendom in the High Middle Ages. So, the 9th to the 13th centuries, the 11th to the 14th centuries. This is a period that is known as the High Middle Ages. It is supposed to be the most refined, or the most refined and prosperous, or the more prosperous part of the Middle Ages. After the end of the barbarian incursions and the Viking and the Magyar and the Saracen incursions, and it lasts until about the 14th century, and it ends with the Black Death. So that's the High Middle Ages. So, about the Norman conquest to the bubonic plague. Maybe up to the 100 Years' War, something like that. So, a friend of mine on Instagram, Rick Perry, had informed me that there was this Roman Catholic doctrine, this Augustinian scholastic doctrine, or doctrine of Thomistic thinking, that said that when Jesus died on the cross, when Jesus Christ had his passion on the cross and founded the church, he promised his apostles that there would come this great age, this comforting age in which the shepherd would lead the sheep and they would be protected from the wolves. And this is in the scriptures or something. And later on, Saint Augustine said that this was going to be the millennial reign of Christ. So instead of preterism, instead of Protestant futurism or Protestant historicism, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church of the West teaches that there is neither a pre-tribulation or a post-tribulation period, but instead there is the amillennial reign of Christ. And they say that the Middle Ages, the 5th to 15th centuries, is the amillennial reign of Christ. So, if you would like to open your Bibles and turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 20. I'm going to read from the King James. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to him, and I will sup with him, and he will be with me. So, there is this Roman Catholic doctrine, apparently, that the Middle Ages, or the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ and of his church, is in fact the Middle Ages. Like, this is supposed to be the millennial kingdom of Christ. It's the our millennial reign, or something like that. I don't know too much about it, but when I cover the feudal church, I'll talk more about it in detail. Let's see here. Amillennialism or amillenarianism is a chiligoristic eschatological position in Christianity which holds that there will be no millennial reign of Christ. Or there will be no millennial reign of the righteous on earth. So, yeah. Augustine of Hippo was an amillennialist. And so the whole thing about the Middle Ages is that it is in fact the amillennial reign of Christ. When I talk about the feudal church, I'll go more into detail about it. Evangelizing the Germanic and Slavic tribal peoples. So, the conquerors of Central and Northern Europe ultimately adopted the religion of their conquered Romanist subjects. The tribal composition of the Germanic cultures helped their acceptance to Christianity. Christianity served as a catalyst for cultural development among these peoples, rather than being a destructive force. So, the barbarian culture to be evangelized, etc. The tribal character of the Germanic cultures. So it says that La Tourette asserts that as the barbarians militarily overran most of the Roman Empire, the barbarians' own way of life or cultures, including their religions, began disintegrating upon impact with what was left of the Greco-Roman civilization. So Christianity did not find itself in a head-to-head competition. So anyways, yeah. Missionaries such as Boniface played key roles in converting Germanic tribes, establishing churches, and forming religious practices. their efforts were met with challenges such as cultural barriers and resistance fueled by pagan beliefs. Despite the obstacles, the Christian faith gradually gained ground among the Germanic peoples, influencing their societal norms and political structures. Similarly, in the Slavic regions, the Byzantine Empire played an important role in Christianizing Slavic tribes, particularly through missionaries like Cyril and Methodius. They created the Glagolitic and Cyrillic alphabets to translate the Bible into Slavic languages. This period, 400 to 800 AD, witnessed the gradual integration of Christianity into the fabric of Germanic and Slavic societies. Celtic Christianity, has exemplified by figures like Patrick, played a noteworthy role in evangelizing various tribes and regions of Europe. While perhaps not as widely known as other forms of Christianity in terms of global impact, Celtic Christianity had a unique approach and cultural context that allowed it to reach and influence certain communities. So, what we have in the Middle Ages in this context is you have the fall of the Roman state in the West and its replacement by these barbarian states. But then you have the Roman Church taking over and Romanizing the barbarians, while the Byzantine Church, evangelized and Hellenized the Slavic peoples of the East. By 1000 or 1000 AD, this process was more or less complete. There were still like a handful of Finnic and Slavic and Finno-Ugrian tribes that were still pagans, but the core of Europe, at least outside of the southern Baltic, was more or less Christianized. So that was kind of something that I wanted to mention right fast. So the central figure of this age is Charlemagne. He was born in 742 and died January 28th, 814. Charlemagne, the son of Pepin the Short and Bertrada, was born in 742. Although his parents married before his brother Carloman was born, they were not legally married at the time of Charlemagne's birth. He was thus thought to be illegitimate. In 741, Pepin had become the mayor of the palace, and in 751 he deposed the last Merovingian king and was declared king of the Franks, a powerful Germanic tribe that lived in the region today known as France or Francia. Little is known about Charlemagne's childhood. In 754, however, he participated in the ceremony with Pope Stephen II, where Pope Stephen II appointed Pepin king. So, Charlemagne, okay, so when Pepin died in October of 768, Charlemagne and Carloman were both proclaimed king. They ruled the kingdom together. Then Carloman died, and Charlemagne was the sole ruler of the kingdom. So here's what happened. the Pope invited the Franks to invade Italy and subdue the Lombards, and has a reward for crushing the Avars and the Lombards and Saxons. The Pope crowned Charlemagne the Emperor of the West. So this is where we get the Holy Roman Empire. By 800, Charlemagne had succeeded in greatly extending his power while crushing several enemies. He ruled all of the Christianized western provinces, except the British Isles, that had once been part of the Roman Empire. As a sworn protector of the church, Charlemagne was in fact the political master of Rome itself. The papacy, or office of the Pope, also recognized Charlemagne's power. The Pope crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day, 800. Charlemagne attempted to create unity and harmony within his vast realm, and to support laws and promote learning that would achieve his goals of the empire. Charlemagne, in contrast with his Merovingian predecessors, who constantly traveled throughout their realms, attempted to create a fixed capital to rival that of Byzantium, or Constantinople. So this is the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. And that's all that I wanted to bring up. So now, let's finally get into it. This is from Astmira, a Russian website. The history of the Middle Ages is short. Briefly about the history of the European Middle Ages. Separation of the whole story into three eras: Antiquity, Middle Ages, and New Time, suggested at the 15th. The then new thinkers of the humanist perceived the era of the Middle Ages allegedly as a period of despair and decline of ancient culture. They hoped for a new time offensive when ancient traditions would be reborn. Therefore, the era of the Middle Ages were also called the Dark Ages. In a narrow sense, this periodization is a more appropriate to apply only to the history of Europe, but it is often used for world history. The beginning of the Middle Ages is considered to be the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476, and its end, the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks, and the end of the 100 Years' War. Both events occurred in 1453. Other important milestones that marked the onset of the New Age are also called the opening of the New World by Columbus in 1492, and the beginning of the Lutheran Reformation in 1517. For the countries of the Middle East, sometimes the beginning of the Middle Ages count from the birth of Islam. There is a so-called concept, the Long Middle Ages, which some French historians adhered to. They dominated, according to them, the only time that the medieval feudal orders in Europe actually ended was when they were replaced by the bourgeoisie only after the revolution in 1789 in France. Periodization or periodization and basic characteristics. In the histories of England, Germany, and Russia, it is usually customary to distinguish three main periods in the Middle Ages: early 5th to 11th century, the High or Classic 11th to 14th, late or early modern era 14th to 16th centuries. The historians of the Romance countries are more often divided in the Middle Ages into only two periods. Since the term Middle Ages was originally used only for the history of Europe, the main characteristics of this era mainly describe Europe specifically. They are not always appropriate to apply to countries or other continents. The basic characteristics are feudal land ownership, when the owners of the land are feudal lords using the labor of semi-dependent peasants. A system of vassalage between the feudal lords, when the lord gives land to his vassals and they carry military service for this. The domination of the Catholic Church, the desire of the Pope to subjugate all the monarchs of Europe, which, however, has never been fully realized. Workshop organization of crafts in guilds into guilds in the cities, which restrained competition. Great resettlement of peoples. The deep and protracted crisis that hit the Roman Empire already in the 3rd century led to the weakening of its military power, the decline of the economy and culture. The empire was divided into two parts: the western, controlled from Rome, and the east, with a center in Constantinople. In the 4th to 5th centuries came the great resettlement of peoples, started with an invasion of Asian steppe nomads or Huns, the Huns, fleeing them and many other barbaric peoples set in motion and invaded the Western Roman Empire. Large-scale migration of entire nations significantly changed the ethnic composition of the population of the entire continent. The resettled barbaric tribes began to create their own kingdoms on the territory of the empire. The power of the Roman emperor weakened so much that it became purely nominal. Then, in 476, finally the throne of the Western Roman Emperor itself had been abolished. Byzantium and the Arab Caliphate. The Eastern Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, had survived and even lasted and flourished for about 1,000 more years under the name of Byzantine. During the early Middle Ages, it remained a powerful superpower, experiencing an economic recovery. In Russia, her capital was called Tsargrad. Part of its territories, however, Byzantium yielded to the Arab conquerors during the Mohammedan Wars, or the Islamic Wars. By the 7th century, on the Arabian Peninsula, the new religion of Islam began. The Prophet Muhammad created the state of the Muslim Caliphate and united in it all the Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. With his successors, these tribes rapidly won Roman and Byzantine possessions in North Africa and in the Near East. They also conquered Iran, a significant part of the Caucasus and Central Asia, and almost the entire Iberian Peninsula. Islam later spread to North India, Indochina, and penetrated the Sahel and tropical Africa. Empire of the Franks and the emergence of European chivalry. As a result of ethnic processes caused by the great resettlement of peoples and Arab conquests, many peoples had formed that still exist. A significant part of the Middle Ages is characterized by a state of feudal fragmentation. Germany and Italy remained fragmented into many small states until the middle of the 19th century. In the 8th to 9th centuries, many European kingdoms had been raided from the side by three peoples. From the north and along the seas and rivers, from the Jutland and Scandinavian peninsulas, sailed Normal, which in the west sailed the Normans, which in the west was called Vikings. In the east, Varangians. In the very center of Europe, in Pannonia, on the plains along the Alps and the Carpathians, belligerent Finno-Ugric tribe of Hungarians who had come there from the Volga region. Hungarians ravaged almost the entire European continent, and from the south of Europe was bothered Arab invasions, committed both from the sea and from land, and from the territory of the Iberian Peninsula. In the state of the Franks, in the course of the fight against the Arabs, a system of feudal longes or feudal lords had been formed, the creation of which is considered to be Karl Martel, who died in 741. The military estate of European chivalry appeared, with its mores and traditions, with its morals and traditions. The grandson of Karl Martel, Charlemagne, in 800 was crowned in Rome as the Emperor of the Romans, nominally thereby reviving the Western Roman Empire. The late Roman and German traditions were closely intertwined in the state of Franks, on the basis of which the European medieval orders developed, with the sons and grandchildren of Charles the Great. The Frankish Empire was divided into three parts. West Francia became France. East Francia, Germany. The middle part of Lorraine later broke up. The title of the emperor was preserved by the rulers of Germany, in whose territory, until the beginning of the 19th century, existed the nominal title Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, proclaimed in 962. In addition to German or Teutonic lands, it included the territories of northern Italy, the Czech Republic, or the Czech lands, and Flanders. High Middle Ages. From the 11th to 14th centuries, the stage of the High European Middle Ages continued, accompanied by a notable strengthening of the economy and culture, urban growth, the spread of university education, the introduction of numerous innovations and inventions. By this time, Christianity had spread in Scandinavia, in the Baltic states, and on the lands of the Slavs and Hungarians. England and Wales were conquered by Normans. A gradual conquest of land from Muslims began on the Iberian Peninsula. Reconquista. One of the most important events of this period has become the Crusades declared by the Pope. The purpose of these campaigns of the Pope was proclaimed the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks, who during the Arab conquests departed these lands in the Levant from Byzantium to the Muslims and later the Seljuks. During the Crusades, 1095 until 1270, Europeans managed to create in Palestine a kingdom, or the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, but it lasted only about a century and a half. Subsequently, Muslims managed to expel the Crusaders from these territories of the Levant. By 1054, the Great Schism or Schism finally had taken shape, and the church split in Christianity or Chalcedonian Christianity into Catholics and Orthodox, which had been long since brewing before that. The later Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Reformation. In the beginning of the 14th century, after several lean years, a large-scale plague epidemic, the bubonic death, came about. The population of Europe decreased by about a third to a half. The depopulation of the Europeans was exacerbated by invasions of new nomads that went by the name of the Mongols. in the beginning of the 13th centuries and the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between the English and the French. The acute shortage of workers due to depopulation led to an increase in feudal oppression and the desire of feudal lords to further enslave the serfs. The reaction to the strengthening of the feudal oppression was the growth of uprisings of peasants and public artisans, and the early bourgeoisie. The most famous and largest of these uprisings, which grew into real peasant wars, was the so-called Jacquerie in France, and the uprising of Wat Tyler in England. During the 100 Years' War, significant changes took place in military affairs. The value of the heavily armored knights, or armored knightly cavalry, had decreased. The role of the regular infantry army of the crossbowmen and the longbowmen had increased. Artillery appeared. At the turn of the Middle Ages and the New Age, the army began to form mainly from professional mercenaries, and they, as a rule, were engaged in robbery, not only in enemy territory, but also in the one that they had to defend. As a result, hostilities began to be more devastating for the civilian population than during the heyday of chivalry. In many European countries, the late Middle Ages is gradually taking shape the political system of absolutism. Monarchs, in alliance with the rich estates of cities, limit the power of large feudal lords and create bureaucratic systems of government. In the period of the late Middle Ages, a phenomenon called the Renaissance, Italian or the French for revival. It was born in northern Italy and later spread throughout Europe. A significant role in this was played by the conquest of Byzantium by Ottoman Turks in 1453. Refugees from Byzantium took libraries and works of art with them, thereby involving Europeans in the cultural heritage of the distant era of antiquity. By that time, rich cities had entered a period of prosperity. This led to the exaltation of estates that were not directly related to feudal relations: merchants, moneylenders and bankers, craftsmen and artisans. They had a different attitude to traditional medieval values and the tough hierarchical order consecrated by the feudal church. In this environment, a new movement in public thought emerged: humanism. It proclaimed the measure of all things were not God, but man, considering the main value not blind obedience in the heavenly and earthly lords, but individual freedom and creativity. With their ideological pillar, they considered the achievements of ancient philosophy and culture and sought to revive them. The spread of the new world view was greatly facilitated by the printing industry, invented by Johann Gutenberg in the middle of the 15th century. In the beginning of the 16th century, due to the abuses of the hierarchs of the Catholic Church, which caused a critical rethinking of religious dogmas by many thinkers, a new split occurred in Western Christianity. German priest and doctor of theology Martin Luther rethought the understanding of New Testament dogmas, rejected many principles of Catholicism. So a new direction was born in Christianity. Protestantism found many supporters and other leaders among the merchants, the artisans, the guild leaders, and craftsmen of the bourgeoisie. Religious disagreements caused numerous wars, shaking many European countries down to the middle of the 17th century. Many historians tend to evaluate reform as a reflection of a conflict between past feudal orders and new bourgeois relations. Protestantism has become the ideology of the bourgeoisie, the nascent new class, or the middle classes. In the fight against Protestantism, Catholics were forced to make serious changes in their church. A set of measures to counter the threat posed by the Protestants to them is called the Counter-Reformation. Great geographical discoveries, the era of initial accumulation. In these same times, important geographical discoveries took place, as a result of which the world view of Europeans had significantly changed. The countries of Western Europe had embarked on the path of colonial conquest, which have made them world hegemons for a long historical period. The development of maritime trade and colonial seizures have created opportunities for unprecedented enrichment of those Europeans who participated in this. Therefore, this era also has another name, the era of initial accumulation. In the 16th to 18th centuries, large private capital was created, the owners of which the former class of feudal lords was gradually forced to give way. As the new bourgeois class took place, the medieval order was dying. The era of the Middle Ages was then replaced by the era of the New Age. And that is a very quick and basic breakdown of the Middle Ages. That is just a quick breakdown of the various stages of the Middle Ages. So now I want to go and look a bit at the life of some different parts and aspects of the medieval culture. Life in England at the time of the Norman conquest. The Norman conquest brought huge changes for the ruling and land-owning classes of medieval England. But for poorer people, there were fewer changes. Although England in 1066 had a number of sizable settlements, the majority of people lived in rural areas, in houses built of straw, wood, or reeds. It wasn't until the late 12th century that stone fortifications were used in the construction of ordinary houses. Village life in Norman England. In the village, life was based around the cycle of the year, with harvesting and sowing the crops important rituals for ensuring food for the whole community. Inventory records of peasants in Norman England show that most families had few possessions, such as the family table and stools, beds, and a chest in which to store goods, such as winter blankets. Animals were valuable possessions to peasant households, and often slept in the same house as the family. The village's land was typically divided into open fields, within which a crop rotation scheme operated. One field was sown with winter crops, a second with spring crops, and a third left to recover before re-sowing the following year. Some fields were held by tenants, some by manorial lord, and others by the village rector. At busy periods such as harvest, many communities would work together, for example, to bring in the crops. Most villages or manors also had a common upon which animals would be grazed without payment. There were often rules about the number and type of animals which could be grazed here, and what rights villagers had, such as the right to collect fallen firewood. The town in Norman England. At the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, towns and cities such as York, London, Winchester, and Southampton were already large and prosperous trading centers. The Norman conquest did nothing to change this, and in fact, in the 200 years following the conquest, the number of towns more than doubled. The Normans founded abbeys around which towns became established. These were trading centers with markets and specialized goods such as salt in Droitwich and cloth in Norwich, in Droutwick and cloth in Norwich. In the Norman towns, houses and business premises were often crowded together, with buildings usually constructed from timber. By the mid-12th century, the medieval town became more organized as individual businessmen formed trade guilds, meaning that trade became more regulated and businesses became more specialized. Life in a medieval castle. Smells, sounds, and structures of the medieval castle. I'm going to go ahead and skip this for now. Medieval Germany, circa 481 to 1350. The German state covered a large geographic area, but for most of its early history, it was subdivided into various tribal territories that eventually formed into competing principalities of feudal lords who were all under one ruler. Various dialects of the German language helped to form a German culture and forged ethnic connections with Slavic and Baltic groups, as well as imperial alliances with Italy and the Germanic-speaking areas of modern Austria and Poland. Northern European and pre-Roman Iron Age Celtic or Celtic influences also played a role in the formation of modern Germany. The transformation from tribal to monarchical and feudal rule in Germany led to an increased emphasis on the importance of property, natural resources, and political changes on the regional and imperial levels greatly impacted medieval Germans, with endemic conflict and warfare due to conflicts between outside ethnic groups as well as between German polities. Some areas of the original German territories, known collectively as Germania or Germania, were officially under Roman rule beginning in the 1st century BCE. The Romans occupied the area up to the Rhine and Danube rivers militarily, but their political hold over the northern and eastern frontiers was weak, so some Germanic tribes were able to assume and keep independent political and social communities. The Romans were pushed out, partly due to Germanic tribal movement over the Rhine in the 3rd century CE. The migration period, 300 to 700 CE, was characterized by various tribes moving into West Central Europe and becoming consolidated as part of the evolving Germanic dynastic state, beginning with the Merovingians and the Carolingians. The Merovingians rose to become a Christian empire under Clovis I. They are best known for creating individual tribal legal codes, combining tribal and imperial law. Beginning in 481 CE, a Merovingian dynasty ruled Gaul, which included most of modern-day Germany. Individual tribes either paid tribute or were added by force into the empire at this time. In 751 CE, the Frankish kingdom under the Carolingian dynasty came to power, expanding into all of Germany, as well as further east and south into Italy, beginning with Charlemagne, crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III in 500 CE, the Franks ruled the largest European empire of the time until its breakdown created three kingdoms in 840 CE. East Francia, West Francia, and the Middle Kingdom, Lotharingia. All right, so this is a map of the Merovingian Empire, 481 to 751 CE. This is the Merovingian era, or the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingian dynasty. This is the Frankish Empire, 751 to 840 CE. East Francia, or the East Frankish Kingdom, established under Louis the German, 843 to 880 CE, and a corner of 10th century Europe. The Kingdom of East Francia was the main source of later German culture and politics. East Francia, or Francia, and much of the Kingdom of Lothair, or Lothar, also called the Middle Kingdom, would make up the modern German state, established in 880 CE as a newly unified empire. Successive German leaders inherited the title of Emperor, ruling what was known as the Holy Roman Empire until 1806. The various principalities were under the protection of the emperor, but could make decisions independently within their own regions. Although separated into tribes, ethnicities, and linguistic regions, Germans developed into a cohesive ethnic and cultural group by the time of Otto I, crowned in 962 CE, the first official Holy Roman Emperor, ushering in the Ottonian or Saxon dynasty. Geographically at this time, Germany had recognizable boundaries, apart from the addition of most of Italy, but continued to fluctuate over time to include parts of the kingdoms of France, Poland, and Hungary. Modern-day Germany does not include Austria, Bohemia, Switzerland, or Italy, all of which were part of the early German Empire. Medieval Germany was dominated and defined by these constantly changing political boundaries, which shaped the complex history of the German people. This is the Holy Roman Empire, or the First Reich, 962 to 1806. And this is modern-day Germany. This is from historymedieval.com. Italian early medieval, a mosaic of kingdoms and cultures. Italy in the early Middle Ages, charting the course of Italy. Italy's early medieval timeline is a captivating journey through a transformative period in its history, from the crumbling remnants of the Roman Empire to the emergence of powerful city-states, spanning roughly from the late 5th to the 11th century. This era is marked by significant political upheaval, cultural exchange, and the birth of new identities. The fall of Rome and the barbarian influx, 5th to 6th century. The decline of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century ushered in the early medieval period in Italy. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. This marked the symbolic end of Roman rule in the Italian peninsula. Various barbarian groups, including the Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and Lombards, descended upon Italy, each leaving its mark on the landscape and culture. The once mighty Roman infrastructure crumbled as these groups established their own kingdoms, competing for dominance. Byzantine Italy, 6th to 8th century. In the midst of this turmoil, the Byzantine Empire maintained control over parts of Italy, notably the Exarchate of Ravenna and the Duchy of Rome. Byzantine influence brought a strong Eastern Roman cultural and religious presence, shaping the Italian identity. The Lombard kingdoms, 6th to 8th century. The Lombards, a Germanic people, established several kingdoms in Italy, with their capital in Pavia. They ruled over much of the peninsula, except for areas under Byzantine control and the Papal States. This period saw the emergence of new political entities that laid the groundwork for regional divisions within Italy. Carolingian period and Papal States, 8th to 10th century. The Carolingian dynasty, centered in the Frankish Empire, exerted influence in Italy among the 8th and 9th centuries. Charlemagne's coronation as Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD brought Italy into the orbit of the Carolingian Empire. Simultaneously, the Papal States emerged as a significant political entity under the leadership of the papacy. The Church played a central role in Italian affairs, both politically and culturally. The rise of city-states, 9th to 11th centuries. Toward the end of the early medieval era, Italy witnessed the growth of powerful city-states, including Venice, Florence, Genoa, and others. These city-states began to exert their independence and play pivotal roles in shaping the Italian peninsula's destiny. They became hubs of trade, culture, and innovation, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the Italian unification in the centuries to come. The Italian early medieval timeline is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the Italian people in the face of sweeping changes. It laid the foundation for the rich tapestry of regional cultures, artistic achievements, and political landscapes that continue to define Italy today. This era's legacy remains palpable in Italy's diverse regions, each with its own distinct history and identity, contributing to the enduring allure of this historic and culturally rich country. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, sacks Rome in 410. The last Western Roman emperor was deposed 476. 493. Theodoric the Great becomes the king of the Ostrogoths. 535 to 554, the Gothic Wars. 568 to 774, the Lombards conquer the Italian peninsula. 751, the Lombards seize Ravenna. 756, the creation of the Papal States. 774, King Charlemagne invades the Kingdom of Italy. 800, King Charlemagne crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. 800. 814, new empire disintegrates after the death of Charlemagne. 827, Muslim Arabs conquered Sicily. 840, Sergius founds the dynasty of the Sergi in Naples. 843, Treaty of Verdun. 846, Muslim Arabs invade Rome. 849, Emperor Louis II invades and divides the southern peninsula. 852, Saracens take Bari and found an emirate. 951, King Otto I assumes the Iron Crown of Lombardy. 960, King Otto I conquers the Kingdom of Italy. 1004, the German King Henry II is crowned Rex Italia. The medieval transformation of France. This episode and the next one of the two will complete the medieval transformation series. As we talk about how life changed from late antiquity under the crumbling Roman Empire to the medieval period of the Merovingians. Alright, this is really not about medieval France. Yeah, this has nothing to do with medieval France. Alright. Medieval Spain! Medieval Spain and feudalism. There was quite a debate whether feudalism existed in Spain or not. Historians believed that feudalism can be traced back to the height of the Dark Ages, especially when dealing with the history of Spain. Feudal system. However, English scholars have the tendency of downplaying feudalism with its application to the early Middle Ages. This was in contradiction to the more recent trends in Spanish historiography, where feudalism was pushed back to the time of the Visigoth kingdom, which is called proto-feudalism. French historians believe that proto-feudalism did not exist in medieval Spain, as sworn by the public instead of individuals. Spain was a medieval superpower. Medieval Spain daily life. Medieval Spain was a battlefield between Muslims and Christians. They fought for their lands, and this fight lasted for 700 years. This marked the peninsula as a military contended space, thereby greatly affecting the lives of the people. The Moorish conquest of Spain and Europe lasted around 700 years. Nonetheless, Christians continued to live in Muslim kingdoms, and so did Muslims living in Christian areas, all of what was referred to as relative peace. However, violence eventually broke out. Every kingdom had distinct regulations about religion and their faith at varying levels. These regulations intended to prevent interaction between religions and prohibited them from partaking in their food. Medieval Spain, people. The rest of the Iberian Peninsula was under Islamic rule, and the population was predominantly Muslim. Arabic was their primary language. Muslim Spain was called Al-Andalus in Arabic. Alongside the Christians and Muslims, there were also a significant number of Jews living in medieval Spain. In both Christian and Muslim kingdoms, and thereby medieval Spain was known as the land of three religions: tres culturas, tres culturas, tres cultures. How rich and powerful was medieval Spain? Medieval Spain was considered a battle for Christians who attempted to regain control from the Moors ever since they conquered Spain in 711 AD. The Moorish influence was prevalent during the early years of medieval Spain, and it was marked by fighting among different Muslim kingdoms. However, the Spanish people eventually and gradually conquered more and more of Spain back, starting with the northern part of the country close to France, and fighting little by little towards the southern part of the realm. Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain. Reconquista is Spanish for reconquest. However, there was an organizing principle called Reconquista that prevailed in medieval Spain. This was a period of 780 years after the Islamic conquest in 711, until the fall of Granada in 1492. Reconquista soldiers in Granada, Spain. This ended before the discovery of the New World that preceded the Spanish colonial empires. The territories which were once Christian and Visigothic were captured and re-Christianized. Medieval Spain also had many networked cities. These cities served as cultural and administrative centers, where the bishops, kings, and government officials were situated. Barcelona, Spain. These cities also had large markets and houses that expanded from a fortified stronghold across the peninsula. Medieval Spain was also known for its great cities, such as Barcelona, Leon, Granada, etc. Medieval Spanish castle Castello Javier, or Castello Javier. Medieval Spain castles. Spain had the most formidable castles in the world. Spain has more than 1,000 Spanish castles recorded throughout history. The castles were built for various reasons. However, the primary reason was to stop the Arabs when they invaded Spain in 711. The Spanish built so many of them, in fact, these castles were mostly concentrated in the northern part, which was where the Arabs advanced when they attacked. When the Spanish military moved to reconquer the peninsula towards the south, they built additional strongholds to prevent the Arabs from reclaiming Spain. These castles were known as Castilla. Castilla. Medieval Spain, kings and queens. The Hispanic Goth monarchy was the known political and legal monarch that succeeded Rome on the peninsula. This was the first effective independent kingdom in all Spanish territories. The crown and leader of the monarch was elected and selected from a particular lineage. However, the collapse of the Hispanic Goth monarchy gave way to the Reconquest, where Christians in the northern part of the mainland founded their own kingdoms and monarchies. They governed spaces and recovered the mainland from the Muslims with the objectives of fully restoring power to the Spanish. Medieval Spain, Spanish Knight Santiago. Medieval Spain knights. Chivalry was already known in Spain when Frankish knights fought to protect the pilgrims at the tomb of Apostle James of Compostela in Galicia during the 10th century. This was introduced to the Spanish knights who fought during the 12th century, who fought during the 2nd century of the Reconquista. Chivalry among knights flourished to a great extent after. However, the chivalry of the Spanish knights cannot be totally associated with military orders of knighthood, as it was conflicted whether the knights were directed by royalty or by the Pope. Medieval Spanish music. Spain had several contrasting cultures that had evidently, one way or the other, influenced its music, especially during the medieval period. This coexistence of a varied cultural landscape and musical influences in the peninsula resulted in a unique blend of music. The Visigoths developed their own kind of music, which became the very first form of medieval Spanish music. The traditions of Spanish medieval music survived long after the fall of the monarchs and the Hispanic rights in favor of the Roman rights. However, the kind of music which were developed along the parallel lines of the church, the people, and literature prevailed. Medieval Spain food. The Arabs had quite an influence on Spanish cuisine. They had introduced new plants like lemons, pomegranates, and eggplants. They also colored food during the medieval period. The Arabs also passed on other cooking techniques, and these techniques were gradually spread to the northern regions. Because of the Iberian Peninsula's highly diverse geography, several distinct cultures existed in the region, and various unique cuisines also existed. Spain had been a great colony of Mediterranean culture. Spain had been a great colony of Mediterranean cuisine. Medieval Spain, Spanish nobility, Moroni Don Gabriel de la Cueva, or Cueva. Medieval Spain clothing. Like a lot of things in the Middle Ages, clothing was dictated by the feudal system. The clothes worn in the medieval period reflected the status of the person wearing them. The basis for clothing in medieval Spain was regular tunics and loose outer wraps, especially for Muslims. However, there may be considerable variations depending on region, ethnicity, and class. Spanish peasants wore tunics. Soldiers wore scarlet capes, which were similar to the ones Christians wore in the northern part of Spain. Spanish peasants and slaves. Spain was the first Atlantic empire that established sugar plantations in the Americas. When Spain began to colonize what was known as the Americas, it also aimed to exploit the New World's valuable resources, such as gold and silver. A number of Spanish settlers found dominance in the lives of the peasant class, who were primarily Indians and Africans. Spain tried to create what they referred to as an exclusive society. However, this society caused the downgrade of Indians and Africans into many inferior states and eventually down to slavery. Spain forced the people to work in mines, granting them only a few rights and very little autonomy. And right after the system had depleted the minerals on the island, Spain sent more explorers westward. Medieval Spain summary. After the last reigning Gothic king, Pelayo became one of the earliest Spanish heroes who reigned after the Muslim rule. These refugees had laid the foundation for modern Spain. The Second Kingdom of Navarra, which was founded by Garcias Ineguez, entered and subdued the realm. The Spanish people regained Spain back and conquered many more colonies after. They began with the northern part of the peninsula, close to France, moving towards the south. Spain had gone through a lot since. After several years of fighting, Spain finally reunited under the rule of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, where they united forces and took back Granada from the Moors in 1492, thereby ending the Reconquista. Right after the Reconquista, the Muslims and Jews who lived in Spain were converted to Christians. Otherwise, they were expelled from the country. An introduction to medieval England. Duke William of Normandy's resounding triumph over King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 marked the dawn of a new era for England. The overthrow of the Saxon Kingdom of England was to transform the country. The Normans conquered, from how it was organized and governed to its language and customs, and perhaps most visibly today, its architecture. Norman rule. William and his knights and the castles they built transformed England and helped impose Norman rule. Norman clergy dominated the church, and monasteries and churches were constructed in the new Romanesque or Norman style of architecture. William's Survey of England, Domesday Book 1086, recorded a land governed by feudal ties. Every level of society was under an obligation of service to the class above. Punitive forest laws protected the royal hunting preserves and reinforced the new regime. William I, seated on his throne, depicted in the late 12th century Battle Chronicle, written by the monks of Battle Abbey. Normans and Angevins. However, baronial revolts plagued the conqueror, and his son William Rufus reigned 1087 to 1100. William's youngest son, Henry I, reigned 1100 to 35, brought peace and administrative and legal reform. But the country descended into chaos and civil war when Henry's nephew, Stephen, reigned 1135 to 54, was crowned king. despite the rival claim of Henry's daughter Matilda. Order was restored by Matilda's son Henry II, reigned 1154 to 89, the first of the Angevin or Plantagenet kings, a monarch of boundless energy and ungovernable rages. He traveled constantly through his vast dominions, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. The many fortresses he raised included Dover Castle, which was rebuilt partly as a splendid stopover on the road to Canterbury and the shrine of his turbulent priest, St. Thomas Becket, murdered in his cathedral by Henry's knights in 1170. Henry's later reign was clouded by his fraught relationship with his sons and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. When he died in France in 1189, he was at war with his eldest son Richard, who had joined forces against him with the French king. Magna Carta. Richard I, the Lionheart, reigned 1189 to 99, was always abroad or on crusade. His younger brother John reigned 1199 to 1216, was forced by his barons to sign Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which was intended to limit his powers in 1215. But ultimately he ignored it. He incensed barons invited Prince Louis of France to invade England in May 1216. John died in October 1216 when his 9-year-old son Henry, assuming the throne in the midst of French invasion. Louis conquered almost all of southeastern England, though not Dover Castle, but retreated in 1217 after defeats in the Battle of Sandwich and in the streets of Lincoln. Reconstruction drawing of the siege of Dover Castle in 1216, during the civil war between King John and his English barons. Here, French forces supporting John's enemies undermined the castle's northern defenses. Kings, barons, and favorites. The long reign of Henry III, reigned 1216 to 72, saw further baronial unrest from the late 1250s headed by Simon de Montfort. But after de Montfort's death at the Battle of Evesham, 1265, and the long siege of Kenilworth Castle, Warwickshire, rebellion was finally suppressed. This was a time when chivalric heraldry blossomed, enhanced by the craze for legends of King Arthur. Edward I reigned 1272 to 1307, another great castle builder, united his barons behind the conquest of Wales, 1277 to 84, and his attempts on Scotland. His Scottish policy proved disastrous for his less warlike son Edward II, reigned 1307 to 27, though whose defeat at Bannockburn 1314, was followed by Scots raids far south of the border. The king's devotion to his low-born favorites, Piers Gaveston, and then the Despenser family, enraged his barons. So when Edward's spurned wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, invaded from France in 1326, they quickly gained support. Edward was forced to renounce the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son and was almost certainly brutally murdered at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. Although Isabella and Mortimer initially governed, Edward III reigned 1327 to 77, assumed control in his own right in 1330, ousting his mother and executing her lover. Edward was a great warrior king, winning victories in France at Cressy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, during the early years of what was later known as the 100 Years' War, 1337 until 1453. His armies included archers using longbows, which became the dominant English weapon of the later Middle Ages. Heraldic floor tile in the chapter house at Westminster Abbey, depicting the 3 lions of England, Henry III's coat of arms. The shield is flanked by centaurs and wyverns, beasts with dragons' heads and serpents' tails. Church and society. Monasteries and churches flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries. New religious foundations, such as almshouses and hospitals, cared for the poor and sick. Towns grew in size and autonomy, and as the old divisions between Normans and the English began to break down, English began to replace Norman French as the dominant language. Commerce developed, helped by better coinage and the growth of the wool trade. By the growth of a money-based economy began to put the old feudal order under pressure. Plague, revolt, and piety. Then, in 1348 to 49, the established order and the population were struck a devastating blow by the Black Death, which killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population. The most immediate of its many effects was an acute labor shortage. Survivors demanded higher wages, and bondmen refused to do unpaid service for feudal masters. Attempts to fix wages and prices at pre-plague rates only increased resentment. Edward III's grandson and successor, Richard II, reigned 1377 to 99, inherited a bankrupt treasury, and discontent over reverses in the conflicts with France. In 1381, simmering grievances erupted into the Peasants' Revolt, also known as Wat Tyler's Revolt. The feudal system was not the only institution being challenged. For the first time in English history, the doctrines as well as the actions of the church were being attacked by John Wycliffe and the Lollards. Yet still religion remained all-pervasive in daily life, though the focus of piety changed from monasteries to parish churches. Many people sought salvation by praying. Many people sought salvation by paying to have prayers said for them in chantry chapels and undertaking pilgrimages. Aerial view of Wareham Piercy. Aerial view of Wareham Piercy in Northumberland. The village had a population of 200 in the 13th century, but witnessed a steep decline in the 14th century. Scottish raids were followed by the Black Death, which saw the population reduce from about 67 to 45. Royal upheavals. In 1399, Richard II was deposed and murdered by Henry IV, reign 1399 to 1413, the first of the many upheavals to afflict the monarchy during this period. Though assailed from many quarters, Henry held on to his throne, and his Lancastrian dynasty was reproved by the achievements of his son, the greatest of all English warrior kings, Henry V. Saint Henry V reigned 1413 to 22, won a startling victory over the French at Agincourt in 1415, achieved largely thanks to the all-conquering English longbow. By the time of his premature death, he was ruling half of France. The Battle of Agincourt, depicted in a 15th century French manuscript. Bibliothèque nationale de France, Chronicles Brouage. The Wars of the Roses. More dangerous was the increasingly fashionable expression of power and status through the recruiting of private armies of liveried retainers. These contributed to the breakdown of order as Henry VI reigned 1422 to 61 and 1470 to 71 proved incompetent to rule, and rival aristocratic factions contended to control both monarch and kingdom. These feuds developed into a series of short campaigns and often bloody battles, fought at intervals between 1455 and 1485, during which the crown changed hands 6 times. Cannon were used in some sieges, but the longbow remained the dominant weapon. The Yorkist Edward IV reigned 1461 to 70, and again 1471 to 83, eventually emerged victorious. But his brother Richard III, who reigned 1483 to 85, alienated supporters by seizing the throne from his nephew Edward V, reigned 1483. Richard was defeated and killed at Bosworth, 1485, by the Lancastrian heir Henry Tudor. The 15th century manuscript illustrates an execution during the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 85, one of the bloodiest conflicts in English history. The so-called Cousins' War stemmed from a dynastic quarrel between the descendants of Edward III over possession of the English crown. Gent University Library, MS 236. All right, I'll be right back in a second. Medieval Scotland history, life in the Middle Ages. We imagine life in medieval Scotland to be the picture painted in Scottish ballads with kings, queens, knights, and wonderful castles at the forefront of life back then. There may have been all these things, but the reality of life during the Middle Ages for the Scots was very different. Let's take a look at how the Scots lived and dispel the fairy tale. Early Middle Ages. During the 5th century, Scotland was made up of 4 separate kingdoms, namely the Picts, the Scots of Dalratia, the Britons of Strathclyde, and the kingdom of Bernicia. By the 9th century, following the invasion of the Vikings, the Scots and the Picts joined together to make the kingdom of Alba. By the 12th century, Scottish rulers combined French culture with their own, as was their preference at the time. Scotland established its independence with characters such as William Wallace, who is still much admired today, and Robert the Bruce, fighting for the right to self-govern. Scottish medieval castles. Scotland's castles began as defensive timber structures with wooden palisades evolving into magnificent stone fortresses as the Middle Ages progressed. These stone-built castles were comfortable inside and had huge kitchens with delicious food, where delicious food was prepared to be saved at lavish banquets. French wine and ale were the drinks of the day, while boar, venison, deer, and rabbit were popular meats, as were herbs and spices that seasoned the dishes. Singers and musicians would entertain the guest. Ladies of the castle were pampered by their ladies in waiting, and would spend hours embroidering linens or weaving, while the men folk went out hunting and hawking. The castle walls were decorated with beautiful hanging tapestries, while the only light when the hours of darkness descended would have been candles. When it came to visiting the bedroom, people used guard robes, which in essence were holes above a cesspit. Castles, although elaborate and far more luxurious than where the peasants lived, were places full of obnoxious smells. The workers. So what type of work would your average medieval Scot undertake? There were many different jobs, with tasks such as baking, butchering, or spinning being popular jobs that were necessary to everyday life. Other occupations included singers, minstrels, or clerical people, while trades, if you had one, were a good way of making a living. The apothecary made and sold medicine. Barbers, believe it or not, cut hair, but also practiced bloodletting and would sometimes perform operations. Further trades included shoemakers, swineherds, fletchers or arrow maker, coopers who made barrels, and hatters. Those who were skilled trained as apprentices in order to win the right to practice their skills. Scottish food in the Middle Ages, the rich. Food eaten in the Middle Ages differed greatly from the types of food we deem acceptable to eat now. Noble Scots back then thought nothing of eating swan, for instance, a beautiful bird that is now protected. Animals such as seals, porpoises, lampreys, and even peacocks would be caught and served. In fact, birds were a huge part of the staple diet, with geese, pheasants, and many wild birds favored. The Scots also ate plenty of fish, as the church forbid the eating of meat on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays in the Middle Ages. Popular fish were herrings, salmon, bream, pike, and eels. Medieval noble kitchen. Peasants. Food that peasants ate were quite different to the food the rich ate, as you would expect. Peasants would eat more or less the same sort of food on a daily basis, twice a day. Usually their meals would be made from homegrown produce made into oat bread, porridge, and oat cakes known as bannocks. Pottage was also a popular meal and was made from vegetables into a type of soup or stew. If they were lucky, they may have mutton as an accompaniment. Those who kept cows and chickens would have eggs and milk to eat, while everyone drank a weak type of beer, as very often the water was not safe to drink as it was contaminated. People relied on the harvest coming in, and if it did not, very often people would die from starvation. Many peasants turned poacher during hard times and would steal the landowner's fish during the hours of darkness in order to feed their families. Food was, food was cooked over a central fire in the house. As peasants' houses consisted of only one room, the central fire served as cooker, heating, and light. Medieval Scottish clothing. Depending on your station in life, what you wore was a given rule, in that peasants wore simple clothing, while the rich and regal population would dress in more colorful, elegant clothing. Highland Scots stuck to their Gaelic roots, with both men and women wearing the shirt or tunic known as a lin, with the men wearing a mid-length version compared to the ladies' full-length garment. Those with a little more income would wear trousers or brays, while poorer peasants would cut their linen in grease to waterproof them. Some Scots also wore woolen hose that were a type of footless tight. Contrary to popular belief, the kilt did not come into being until centuries later, while neither did the Scottish bonnet. Medieval Scots wore a kind of kilt known as a belted plaid that was similar to a wraparound cloak and was an outer garment used to keep them warm. These belted plaids were not worn in battle, as warriors would change into battle simply wearing their linens. Men wore hats or hoods at this time, while shoes were made of leather and offered little protection against the elements. Scottish sports and pastimes in the Middle Ages. Hawking and hunting. One of the most popular of pastimes in Scotland at this time was hunting and hawking. Hunting and hawking was mainly done by the nobles, with hunting played out on horseback. The nobles would use spears and longbows, while in the later Middle Ages, crossbows were introduced. Animals hunted included deer, hare, rabbit, wolves, and wild boar, and special hunt attendants would collect the dead and injured prey. In contrast, hawking was done on foot without weapons, as large birds of prey were used to catch small animals and birds. Specialist falconers were responsible for training the birds and were held in high regard, while a well-trained falcon was a prized possession of the owner. Medieval sports. People who lived in medieval Scotland enjoyed a number of sports that would take place in their own towns and villages. Popular events included wrestling, pitching quilts, bowling, fighting with cudgels or clubs, archery, a primitive type of football, badminton played with balls and paddles, ice skating performed with cows, shin bones for blades tied to their feet. Medieval beliefs in Scotland. Religion and what people believed in the Middle Ages was extremely important to them all over Europe, and none more so than in medieval Scotland. Those who were the most dedicated would give up everything to take holy vows to become a monk or a nun, while others would work in monasteries in a lay capacity. When it came to places of worship, medieval Scotland was littered with churches, monasteries, cathedrals, shrines, holy wells, and burial grounds. Ordinary folk would go on pilgrimages to holy shrines in order to receive special graces from God. Their greatest fear was that of the devil, and hell, therefore, prayer and sacrifice became a mainstay of their lives. Nobles would sponsor pilgrimages, while pilgrims would sew lead pilgrim badges into their clothing in order to gain protection from a saint. Throughout the year, there were many festivals and religious feasts celebrating the lives of saints, with the patron saint of Scotland being St. Andrew, who was a Christian apostle. Inside churches, Bible stories were depicted in wall paintings and embroideries, as well as in stone carvings. Medieval plays were also acted out regularly and were very popular with the masses. As Christianity took over from pagan religions, pagan sites were transformed into Christian sites, while wealthy folk made sure of their place reserved in heaven by donating plenty of money to the church. The Black Death. The Black Death first took hold in England, and the Scots were very smug about it, saying it was the revenge of God upon the English. This, of course, was not the case, and soon the disease that knew no boundaries arrived in Scotland just before the Scots were about to launch an invasion of England. They thought to take advantage of England's plight, but by 1350 the Black Death took hold. Scottish society was badly hit, including ordinary people and peasants alike. Just like in England, the peasants who survived the plague began to demand higher wages as labor was scarce. Churches and cathedrals put on plays called the Dance of Death. These plays were put on to remind everyone, rich and poor, that their final judgment would be by God, whatever their station. The Black Death claimed thousands of Scottish lives, exactly as it had done all over the European continent. The Border Reivers, 1300 to 1600. The Border Reivers gangs hailed from within a mile of the English/Scottish borders between the 1300s and 1600s, and raided the land around the borders, constantly within the same time period. The Reivers gangs were organized according to their families and clans, with feuding and raiding commonplace. The gangs would steal sheep, cattle, and horses. Prior to 1513, thousands of raids, along with armies of thousands of men, had been killed in long battles along the borders of England and Scotland. These skirmishes and wars went on for hundreds of years and meant the border folk lived among violence for years. The border reivers' gangs were known for their violence, but the emergence of poetry, ballads, and how the people became masters in horse riding and its related pastimes were also associated with the time. The march wardens were appointed officials on both sides in the conflict who tried to bring some sort of law and order to the area. Churches in the area were fortified so that when people required sanctuary, they would have somewhere safe to take refuge. Medieval Scottish monarchs. The kings and queens of medieval Scotland could not sleep easy in their beds, as not only were outside forces a threat, but there were threats from within, specifically the Scottish nobles. The eldest son of King Robert III died in suspicious circumstances at Falkland Palace in 1399. King Robert sent his remaining son James to France, but his ship was attacked, and James was taken captive and remained so in England for 18 years. James eventually married Joan Beaufort, the cousin of King Henry VI of England, and returned to Scotland in 1424. This marriage was unusually for the time a love match. James became James I of Scotland and began the process of reclaiming Scotland as his, as there were those who also thought the throne was their right. Earl of Athol. Earl of Athol. Plots and counterplots ensued, resulting in the murder of James I on February 21st, 1437, at Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, at the hand of Sir Robert Graham. Queen Joan, who survived the attack, vowed to bring the perpetrators to justice and had them hunted down. Sir Robert Graham and the Earl of Athol were tortured without mercy and executed. Medieval period in Ireland. Key events and figures. The medieval period in Ireland is typically defined as spanning from the 5th to the late 16th centuries. The Irish medieval period is a significant era, characterized by the establishment of Christianity after the Golden Age period, the development of distinct Irish culture and complex political landscapes. This period is commonly divided into two main phases: the early medieval 5th to 12th centuries and the later medieval 12th to 16th centuries. The early medieval period, 5th to 12th centuries. The arrival of Christianity in Ireland, traditionally associated with St. Patrick in the 5th century, marked a pivotal shift in Irish society. Irish monasteries became the centers of religious, cultural, and educational life, with notable foundations like Clonmacno's Kells in Iona. These monastic communities were not only spiritual hubs, but also centers of art, learning, and manuscript production, exemplified by treasures like the Book of Kells. The early medieval period was marked by a flourishing of Celtic culture, including distinctive art, literature, and music, the creation of illuminated manuscripts, intricate metalwork, and the construction of stone churches and round towers showcase the artistic achievements of this time. Additionally, epic tales and sagas, such as those found in the Teon Bo Cuahawalenge, reflect the rich storytelling traditions of the Irish people. Ireland was divided into numerous kingdoms and tuaths, tribal territories, each ruled by local chieftains. This decentralized political structure led to a landscape of shifting alliances and conflicts. The emergence of powerful dynasties, such as the O'Neills and O'Briens, shaped the political dynamics of the time. The Vikings. The Viking Age in Ireland began in the late 8th century, marked by raids on coastal monasteries and settlements. The Vikings, primarily Norse seafarers from present-day Scandinavia, targeted rich ecclesiastical sites for plunder, such as Clonmacnoise and Glendalough. Glendalough. The initial raids quickly escalated into more permanent settlements. The Vikings established several key urban centers in Ireland, notably Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. Dublin, in particular, became a significant trading hub, serving as a gateway for trade between Ireland and continental Europe. These towns were characterized by wooden structures, marketplaces, and fortifications, laying the groundwork for future urban development. The interaction between the Vikings and the native Irish resulted in cultural exchange. The Vikings brought their own customs, trade practices, and craftsmanship, which influenced local communities. Norse art, including metalwork and woodworking, blended with Irish styles, leading to a fusion of artistic traditions. Viking raids and settlements led to significant conflict with the Gaelic Irish. Many Irish chieftains sought to defend their territories, resulting in battles and skirmishes. Notable figures such as Brian Boru, emerged during this time, uniting various Irish kingdoms against Viking incursions, culminating in the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. This battle marked a significant turning point as Brian Boru's forces defeated the Vikings, though he himself was killed in the conflict. Over time, many Vikings in Ireland assimilated into Gaelic culture, adopting the Irish language and customs. This integration led to a blending of cultures, with the descendants of Vikings often referred to as Hiberno Norse. The late medieval period, 12th to 16th century. The later medieval period began with the arrival of the Normans, who invaded Ireland in the late 12th century, with King Henry II being the first English king to set foot in Ireland. This marked a significant shift in Irish history, as the Normans established control over large parts of the country, introducing feudalism and changing the landscape of power. Key figures like Richard de Clare Strongbow played prominent roles in the invasion and subsequent settlements. The Gallo Glasses, the Gallo Glasses, the Gallo Glasses, elite mercenary warriors from the Scottish Highlands, were brought to Ireland during the 13th century. Their name is derived from the Scottish Gaelic Galloglath, Galloglath, meaning foreign warriors. They were primarily of Norse Gaelic descent and served Irish chieftains, providing them with military strength in their struggles against rival clans and external threats. The interaction between the native Gaelic Irish and the Anglo-Norman settlers led to a blending of cultures. The interaction between the native Gaelic Irish and the Anglo-Norman settlers led to a blending of cultures, but also to tensions and conflicts. The Normans built castles and towns, such as Dublin, which became significant centers of commerce and administration. Over time, many Normans assimilated into Irish culture, adopting the Irish language and customs. Despite the Norman presence, Gaelic culture and political structures persisted. Powerful Gaelic families such as the McCarthys and O'Donnells continued to exert influence, and the Irish language remained dominant in many regions. The Gaelic lords often resisted Norman encroachment, leading to a series of conflicts, including the Battle of Kinsale in 1601. The later medieval period also saw the rise of Protestantism in Ireland, particularly following the English Reformation in the 16th century and the Tudor plantations. The establishment of the Church of Ireland and the suppression of Catholic practices led to significant social and religious tensions, setting the stage for future conflicts. By the late 16th century, the Gaelic order was in decline due to a combination of military defeats, political fragmentation, and external pressures from English rule. The Desmond rebellions, 1569 to 1583, and the subsequent suppression of Gaelic culture marked the beginning of a new era in Irish history, leading to increased colonization and the marginalization of the Irish language and customs. The flight of the Earls. In September 1607, fearing for their lives and the loss of their lands and titles, Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and Hugh O'Donnell, the Earl of Tyrconnell, made the fateful decision to leave Ireland to seek support for their cause against English rule. This event marked a pivotal moment in the decline of Gaelic power in Ireland and had far-reaching implications for the country, and is known as the Flight of the Earls. History of Poland during the Middle Ages. History of Poland. Poland, History, Culture, and Society. Balaska, Ba Torokis Loch 2007. Introduction. Poles are Slavs. Slavs belong to the Indo-European people called the Wends and Ans. Slavs' ancestors came from Asia not later than the first millennium before Christ. They split into three groups: Eastern, Southern, and Western Slavs. Poles, like Czechs, belong to Western Slavs. Slavs were described by ancient chroniclers who wrote that they had very rigid customs. Husbands and wives had to be faithful, but each man could have several wives. Widows could die with their husbands, e.g., a widow could commit seppuku by burning herself at the stake with her husband's body. Slavs were friendly to prisoners of war, although they engaged in cruel wars. Generally, hospitality was characteristic of the Slavs. They liked eating, drinking, and dancing. They believed in many gods. There were different gods for weather, families, friends, and so on. Slavs worshipped them in holy forests or on hills. They worshipped nature too, e.g., trees or streams. Their world was full of ghosts and mystic powers. In the early period of the Middle Ages, many tribes had lived on the lands which became the territory of the Polish state. They were living in Major Poland, in Polish called Wielkopolska, in Silesia, Śląsk, in Minor Poland, Malopolska, in Mazovia, Mazowozy, in Kuwavia, Kojawi, and in Pomerania, Pomors. Another territory which was important in the history of medieval Poland was Prussia. Prusy, or Prosy. The Vistulanians and the Polanians were the most important Polish tribes. The Vistulanians lived along the banks of the upper Vistula, in the territory of Minor Poland. It was a great tribe which was subordinated to Bohemia in the 9th and 10th centuries. At that time, the Polanians built their own state. They were living in Major Poland, and they extended their authority and power over other lands. Medieval France. The name France was derived from tribes called the Franks. Clovis, a 15-year-old boy from the Frankish tribe, was appointed leader. He eventually killed the members of this family to rid himself of rivals and united other tribes under his rule. When the ruler of the Frankish tribe named Clovis died, the kingdom was divided into 4 smaller tribes ruled by his sons. Life in early medieval France was not sophisticated. The tribe who lived in France during the early medieval period were not very organized. Most of these men were hunters and trappers. The word France is derived from the Latin word Francia, which means land of the Franks or Frank land. Medieval France. Medieval France, feudalism. Feudalism flourished in medieval Europe from the 9th to 15th centuries. A system of legal, military, and social customs defining the relationship of holding land in lieu of services or labor. Feudalism was the result of the decentralization of the Carolingian Empire. As a result, soldiers secured a system of rule over their lands with powers encompassing the judicial, political, economic, and social domains. Kings and queens were the greatest lords of Europe, and all nobles and knights were their vassals. Nobles were vassals of kings and queens. Many were also lords of lower ranking nobles and knights. Knights served their noble lords in exchange for land. Peasants owned no land, so they were not part of the feudal system, but many peasants worked on land owned by nobles or knights. Medieval France, the feudal system. Medieval French people. Charles the Great of France, also known as Charlemagne, was one of the greatest rulers of medieval France. France was then divided into regions referred to as counts, and his dynasty included a great section of the central part of Europe. One of the most important dynasties was the Carolingian dynasty, which included the greater section of Central Europe as well as northern and central Italy. Charlemagne's system of government divided the realms into regions, which were ruled by local counts. Charlemagne also introduced a law-making education compulsory for children, because he wanted every child to become good Christians, as faith played a vital role in the development of the country. This is Charlemagne, king of the Franks, of the Carolingian era. Medieval life in France. By the middle of the 8th century, the Merovingian dynasty was overthrown. The king was a very important figure. He was not only considered a warlord, but he was also a religious figure, and the people were his chosen subjects as a Christian leader. These roles in leadership sprung from a mixture of politics, religion, and culture. And this is a map of the Merovingian, Carolingian controlled areas in the 8th and 9th centuries. In the 12th and 13th centuries, French culture, authority, and power were passed on from rural centers to the cities where the royal court was. Paris had become an artistic and commercial hub, as well as an administrative and judicial center for the realm. The people in France lived through the motto, one king, one faith. This so-called religion of royalty was introduced and spread through religious ceremonies and symbols. How rich and powerful was medieval France? The French kings derived most of their power, honor, and respect from religion, particularly from written works about Christianity embellished with illuminations. However, the Huguenots and the revolutionaries tried to destroy them in the 16th and 18th centuries, respectively. By eradicating the power of the church and monarch, and by eliminating these traces of religious power and influence of the church over the people, they believe that they can regain power. Medieval France. Medieval Chateau Chenonceau. Chateau Chenonceau. Chenonceau. Medieval French chateau. A chateau is the French equivalent of an English manor house. It was where the French lords and their families lived in medieval France. Although it was used to describe a castle, it was not used in the same way as most castles during the medieval period. In English, French chapoyers, they were more commonly referred to as palaces or country houses rather than castles. Medieval France, French castles, carcassonne walls and towers. Carcassonne walls and towers. Medieval French castles. France was known to some as the country of castles, primarily because there were so many castles in France. Historical scholars believe that castles in France had generally strong beginnings. The first castles were known as donjons. These early castles were towers that had a very simple design. They were referred to as such since these towers gave them the advantage over invaders and attackers. Throughout the course of the medieval period, castles slowly appeared, with many built in France, Normandy. These medieval castles were much bigger and stronger than the donjons. Medieval French kings and queens. The succession of the French king was legitimized by a coronation ceremony. French monarchs were ruled by several dynasties of kings. The first was the Merovingian dynasty, which ruled until 751, followed by the Carolingian dynasty. After the Carolingian dynasty, the Capetan dynasty ruled the realm from the 9th to the 17th century. Here are a few of the famous kings and queens of France. Charlemagne, known as Charles the Great or Charles the First. Charlemagne, known as Charles the Great or Charles the First, was one of the most famous French kings. He united most parts of Western Europe and laid a great foundation for modern France and Germany. Louis the Pious was known as a fair and a debonair king. He was the king of France and the co-emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, together with his father Charlemagne. Louis the Pious was known as a fair and debonair king. Louis XVI was king of France from 1774 to 1791. He attempted to reform France by making the rich pay higher taxes. However, he was vetoed by the aristocrats and failed in ending the division. Louis XVI was executed in 1791 during the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette was the wife of King Louis XVI. She was known to be the icon of royal decadence and profligacy. She was beheaded during the French Revolution for charges of treason. Joan of Arc was a legendary figure in medieval France. Medieval French knights. French knights had been a great part of the French aristocracy. The French knights founded and ruled the Crusader states. Bertrand du Guesclin was named the greatest French knight of his time. He defended Rennes against England and raised the morale of the people of France. This attracted the king's attention, so much that the king sent him to battle with Charles II of Navarre, whom he also defeated. Medieval Spain, medieval Spanish Knight Santiago. Medieval French music. During the 12th century, the earliest records of music in France were polyphonic organum. Secular music in France during the medieval period was also highly dominated by troubadours and trouvaries. The known poets and musicians of the Middle Ages. They created music in several forms, such as the ballad and Leah. However, the most famous was Adam de la Halle. Trouveret medieval musicians. Trouveret's medieval musicians. Notre Dame in Paris. France was one of the schools for polyphonic organum. This style flourished in the country, especially at Notre Dame Cathedral from 1170 to 1250. However, as far as medieval French music was concerned, the only composers of notes whose works have survived to the present day are Leonin and Perrotin. Leonin and Perrotin, who were believed to have written the famous Magnus Liber. Medieval French food. Banquets were great opportunities to entertain guests in style, especially during the French medieval period. French foods and feasts were lavishly prepared. French cuisine was also mostly made from the meat of peacocks, herons, and swans. Other exotic spices from faraway lands and farms, such as saffron, cumin, ginger, nutmeg, and cinnamon, also made it to the list of top ingredients in preparing French food. This kind of food preparation was very common among aristocrats of medieval France. It reflected the host's wealth and influence, as well as their connections with other aristocrats and wealthy families from other realms. Medieval French clothing. Clothing and fashion in the medieval period were always dictated by the feudal system. It reflected the status of the person. Among the nations in Europe during the Middle Ages, there is a common standard of fashion. This only varied according to the customs and culture of the country, as well as their race. It has also changed over time. However, medieval French clothing was considered capricious. At some point in the medieval period, it became fickle and unpredictable. It changed from every quarter of any style of clothing as well as fashion. This is a map of medieval France and the Angevin Empire, medieval Europe. This is the Domaine du Paris, the domain of the king. This is the Angevin Empire, the Duchy of Brittany and the Duchy of Normandy and the Duchy of Toulouse in the south of France. French peasants and slaves. French medieval peasants lived in villages. In these villages, almost 10 to 60 families were peasants. Peasants lived in dark huts that were made of wood or wicker. French peasants worked to support their lords, and they gave almost half of their time to working in the fields, tending to farm animals, cutting timber, and doing other manual labor. France also had several slave colonies in the Caribbean, and the biggest was in Saint Domingue, which was later known as Haiti. There were approximately 500,000 slaves in 1789, and they provided labor for crops and others. Medieval French summary. Feudalism was used by the Normans in France from the time they first settled in the region, and it was a simple and effective system of control. Medieval kings, the Great Revolt, Normandy. All the lands were owned by the king, and some were given to the church, while the rest was leased out to barons and lords under the strict agreement that they will provide services to the king in exchange for the lands leased out to them. A quarter of the land was kept by the king as his personal property, and he has complete control over the system. When the Roman Empire collapsed, France was entirely unlinked to the European economy. There was a great decline in trade, and manners became more self-sufficient than progressive. During the 13th century, catastrophes and famines plagued the French people. The economy of France during the early Renaissance period was marked by growth and developments in agriculture. France was the most populated country in Europe and the most prosperous in the world until 1795. In the 18th century, Paris became world famous, becoming the capital for trade and consumerism. Paris also had social priority and economic force. In the 18th century, Paris became world famous. Upscale arcades, luxury shops, and department stores were built around the city, and France set the standards for the world's consumption of fine products. Life in a medieval castle. Smells, sounds, and structure of medieval castle life. Life in a medieval castle would have been ordered and organized, full of pomp and ceremony, but also very cold and smelly. Essentially, castles were at the heart of medieval society. Castles were built in England and Wales after 1066. They cemented a new social system of feudalism in place. Each new castle secured the power of the local lord over his vassals. To serve the lord, most castles would have been places of frenzied domestic activity. Life in a medieval castle was filled with a constant hubbub of busied work in the kitchens, preparations for celebrations in the great hall, and religious worship in each castle's own chapel. And the layout of a typical medieval castle tended to be influenced by domestic needs rather than defensive concerns. Life without electricity in a medieval castle. Hans S. However, of course, life in a medieval castle would have also included military activities. On many days, knights would have practiced their skills to defend their lord and his king in battle. Preparations were made to defend the castle in case it came under siege, and machinery was made to defend the castle in times of attack. Castles were constantly redesigned and adapted to provide the best possible defense against new and unwelcome threats. There were many different obstacles built to defend medieval castles. These obstacles included everything from moats, sometimes with spikes within, to gatehouses, which contained all manner of obstacles, tricks, and traps. Some castles occasionally even housed prisoners in their dungeons. Prisoners were most often kept for political reasons and were sometimes held in terrible conditions. The damp dungeons of Chillon Castle in Switzerland are brilliantly atmospheric. Credit Lowen Samelli. A picture of domestic life in a medieval castle. When you're exploring a castle today, it's hard to grasp just how busy and how bustling that same castle would have been at the height of medieval times. Castles were partially built to demonstrate the power and significance of their lord and master, and would have had a vast retinue of servants who would have catered to the needs of the noble family. How many people would have worked or lived within a castle? Well, it evidently depends on the size of the castle, but for a site like Goodrich Castle in England, you could expect around 100 to 150 people to surround the lord's family. These would have included everything from cooks to gardeners, grooms and horsemen, and all-important treasurers, who would look after the finances of the entire estate. The focus of domestic life in a medieval castle would have been the Great Hall, which was a common feature to almost every castle in England. This large hall was the focus of hospitality, celebration, and the pleasures of life in a medieval castle, including dances, plays, or even poetry recitals. A medieval feast would have included unimaginably rich foods, even roast peacock, all loaded onto huge wooden tables. This is the remains of the Great Hall in Goodrich Castle, England. Seating in the Great Hall was according to each individual's status. The most important people would have been seated on a raised dais at the head of the hall, positioned above everyone else. If you were less important, though, you'd be seated by the exit doors on the wooden benches at the back of the hall. Adjacent to every great hall would have been the often sizable castle kitchen, where servants and cooks would have prepared the food for their masters and their guests. Medieval food and drinks probably wouldn't taste so good nowadays, though. This is the remains of the Great Hall in Kenilworth Castle, England. The quarters for the land and his family. The solar. The lord and the lady were the heads of the household, but the lord would often be out of residence. His duties would have generally called him to attend the matters of business or politics in London or other major cities. Often, lords would be summoned to supervise and even participate in military activities further afield too. Generally, the lord's servants, such as his groom or chamberlain, master of his bedroom, and expensive properties, would travel alongside him and return to the castle when he did. This meant when the master was away, the castle became a quiet place indeed. In his absence, the lady of the castle would often be in charge of the day-to-day domestic affairs, but the nitty-gritty of running the castle would generally fall to her own servants. When the lord and lady were in residence at the castle, they would have a number of chambers exclusively for their use. Generally, in medieval times, privacy was very hard to come by. Read below for a rather alarming description of communal medieval castle toilets, and the lord and the lady were granted the luxury of their own rooms, usually at the top of one of the towers or the castle keep. These rooms were generally referred to as solar chambers, thought to derive from the words of solitude. This is the remains of the fireplace in the ladies' chambers in Goodrich Castle. In these rooms they could enjoy privacy, comfort, and usually a greater deal of warmth and sunlight, as heat from the great hall would rise up as heat from the great hall would rise to warm up their private chambers. Life in a medieval castle, cold, dark, and very smelly. Don't be tempted to over romanticize the unpleasant realities of life in a medieval castle. To our modern standards of living, most medieval castles would have been incredibly cold, cramped, totally lacking privacy, and would have been disgustingly smelly, and likely home to more than a fair share of rats. Firstly, why were these castles so dark and cold? Well, most medieval castles were made of stone. Although stone was a perfect material for creating strong defensive fortifications, medieval building techniques were basic. The keep of Goodrich Castle, built in the 1100s, only had tiny windows, which meant little light could enter the castle. This meant that most structures could only support tiny windows, which resulted in dark rooms that were constantly cold, as the thick stone could never be fully warmed by the sun. Late medieval developments in architecture and Gothic castle design did improve on these problems, though, and castles built in the late 1200s began to have larger windows and lighter rooms. Incredibly, fireplaces weren't invented until the middle of the medieval period. Until this time, all fires were open fires, which didn't spread heat so effectively and generated a lot of smoke. The invention of the fireplace made rooms warmer, as it heated the stones as well as the chamber itself. This made life in a medieval castle much more bearable. When it came to sanitation, though, things were always truly disgusting. The link between sewage and disease wasn't made until the 18th century, and medieval people remained blissfully ignorant about the health consequences of poor toilet hygiene. Resultantly, most toilets and guardrobes were nothing more than small antechambers in which you'd find a bench with a hole in it. The contents of the toilet would simply fall, usually from a great height, into a cesspool or even into the moat, as the moat was generally stagnant water. It meant that the stench would have been unbearable, especially in the summertime. A loo with a view, St. Andrew's Castle. In addition to the lack of hygiene within the garderobe, there would have been a huge lack of privacy too. Medieval societies didn't really value privacy as we do. So most guard robes would have been a long line of benches with nothing to separate you from your neighbor as he went about his business. Still, I guess it meant you could always had still it I guess it meant that you always had someone to chat to when on the toilet. The Lord, his servants, his vassals, and the peasants. Feudalism and the structure of life in a medieval castle. When castles arrived in England and Wales, they brought with them an entirely new social order, feudalism. The king, in effect, owned all the land in the country and parceled out chunks of it to loyal lords, who could keep the land as long as they remained true to the king. These chunks of land were called fiefs or fees. As medieval times progressed, more and more lords chose to build castles on their lands to exert power and influence. A modern replica of Henry II's throne in Dover Castle, England, it demonstrates the power and influence of the king over everyone who lived upon his lands. Who lived upon his lands. Of course, the Lord couldn't possibly farm all the land himself. Resultantly, the Lord allowed his own vassals, a term meaning people who were in turn indebted to him, the knights, to use some of his lands for their own gain. In return for their lands, the knights had to agree to provide the Lord with military support in battle. Who actually farmed the land? Why?